Merci d'accueillir sur scène le producteur de CNN International et réalisateur du documentaire e-Life, Scott Clarke.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just like to start by apologizing for not speaking in the host language, but unfortunately my French is not quite up for it. I think it's safe to say that every single person in this audience has a cell phone. According to the stats, it's a smartphone less than 2 years old. You probably also have tablets, like myself and my wife's 10-year-old iPad, laptops, maybe even a smartwatch or two. And all of these devices, all of this tech has changed the way that we live our lives, how we access information and how we communicate. And technology is helping us solve some of the most complex issues of our time. It has also given us probably what we use tech for the most, which is, of course, entertainment. But what I'd like to talk about today is what happens when this iPad finally fails on me, or what happens to that projector once it's no longer high enough resolution, or any other electronic device once it reaches the end of its life. I'd like to talk about e-waste, as broken electronics and obsolete electronics are called. My name is Scott Clarke. I'm a documentary producer and director at CNN International, and I've always been fascinated by the topic of waste. We've been very good at waste as human beings. We've been producing it throughout our history. And in fact, it's our material waste that gives archaeologists probably the biggest insights into past cultures. For example, these little ceramic bowls in the bottom left of this picture here were used by the ancient Minoans to drink wine out of at feasts, and were discarded in their thousands afterwards. And that tells archaeologists that disposability is nothing new. And those little disposable ceramic bowls of today are made out of plastic, and that's what I did my first documentary on back in 2012, how plastic pollution affects the world's oceans. Today, governments, companies, society as a whole is talking about plastic pollution, the scourge of plastic pollution. But e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream on the planet, and hardly anybody is talking about it. Which is why I did my latest documentary, released in 2017, called e-Life, on electronic waste. And for that film, we visited probably the most infamous electronic waste processing site on the planet, Agbogbloshie. Some of you may have heard of it, situated on the outskirts of Accra, Ghana's capital city. It's a memorable place, and it comes with its fair share of misconceptions as well as sad stories, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Tech has become inextricable from everyday life, and that trend is only going to become more pervasive. Tech is getting smaller, life cycles are getting shorter, costs are coming down, incomes are going up. And it's estimated that now 50% of the world, 45.9%, about half the world's population now has access to the internet, and the vast majority has access to mobile networks and services, so much so that there are now more mobile phone subscriptions on the planet than there are people. But with this proliferation has come a boom in electronic waste, a boom of e-waste. The last global study of electronic waste was done by the United Nations University in 2017, and it put the figure for our global production of e-waste at 44.7 million tons. And you can see what type of e-waste we're talking about there. And that 44.7 million tons is an 8% rise on just 2 years beforehand. And it's predicted that if production rates continued, that by this year, 2020, we would have hit 50 million tons, of which 1 million tons is just our cables and chargers. Now, it's hard to visualize these kind of huge numbers, so just to put it in context, 44.7 million tons is about the weight of 4,500 Eiffel Towers produced every year. Now, as only 41 countries actually collate data on e-waste generation, the United Nations University concluded that the fate of a large majority of e-waste is simply unknown. And that's what I want to talk about today. What happens? Where does this tech go once it's thrown away? And there are essentially 4 destinations for it. There are regulated, contained, safety-conscious facilities accountable to the authorities, otherwise known as formal recycling. Then there's unregulated, unofficial sites that have few kind of human health and environmental protections, usually in developing nations, such as Abu Lucia, and these are informal recycling sites. And then, of course, you get landfill and dumping. So I'd like to start with formal recycling. Europe, including Russia, produces the second largest amount of e-waste per capita on the planet, coming in at about 16.6 kilograms per person, only behind Oceania, which is on 17.3 kilograms per person. And unfortunately, the worst offender in Europe is the UK at 24.9 kilograms per person. Global recycling rates come in at about 20% of e-waste being recycled in formal facilities. That rises to about 35% in Europe, where we have the most advanced recycling infrastructure. But it's the problem is that there's an awful lot of value that's been thrown away in here. It takes a lot of elements to make the average electronic device. For example, in the average cell phone, we require about half the elements in the periodic table. And all of these elements have worth, they have value. And they have so much value that it's predicted by the United Nations University that the worth of that 44.7 million tons is probably about 55 billion euros per year. That is roughly the GDP of Panama or Luxembourg being thrown away each year. And modern formal recycling facilities like this one in the Netherlands is the most efficient way of extracting that value, but it's also the safest because it's not just benign elements like copper and gold that are used in the manufacturing of electronic devices. There are other more kind of insidious or but industrially useful elements, things like cadmium and chromium and mercury, lead and arsenic. Things that come with them are associated with a whole host of human health issues, things like cancer, breathing problems, developmental defects, and brain damage. So it's essential that the workforce and the environment is protected. And the problem starts with cost. We can currently recycle or retrieve probably about half the elements that go into the manufacturing of technology in formal recycling centers. But the machines required to do that are expensive, and it's also expensive, protecting the workforce and the environment. So some formal recycling facilities in the developed world try and offset those costs by exporting abroad to developing nations where those costs are cheaper. And this is not uncommon. The Columbia University estimated that as much as 23% of all our electronic waste that we create in the developed world is shipped abroad to developing nations. When we were filming eLife, we tagged along with a non-profit organization called the Basel Action Network, which are based in Seattle in the United States. And the Basel Action Network were and still are exposing electronic waste recyclers who are exporting abroad. And they did this by putting tracking devices in broken electronics and then dropping them off at recycling facilities across the US. They dropped about 200 off when we were filming with them. And of those 200, 62 ended up going abroad. Electronic waste, e-waste, is the largest source of organic pollutants and heavy metals in municipal waste. And as such, it is classified as a hazardous waste. And there are certain laws that dictate the movement of hazardous waste around the planet. The first and foremost is the Basel Convention, which was set up in 1992 as a result of growing global outrage for toxic colonialism or developed nations exporting their waste abroad to developing nations. And as of last year, the Basel Convention states that it is illegal for any signatory developed nation to export their waste to developing nations. That includes e-waste, and so if you want to export electronics, they have to plug in and switch on. That's the law under the Basel Convention. Now, there are only 2 countries that have not ratified the Basel Convention in the world, and that is Haiti and the United States. And it's pertinent the United States has not ratified it because all of those electronic waste recyclers that were caught out by the Basel Action Network for exporting their waste abroad weren't actually doing so illegally. And a lot of their waste was going to Southeast Asia, particularly China, and at the point that eLife was released in 2017, China was processing 70% of the world's e-waste. Usually in cities like Guiyu to the southeast of the country, where an estimated 75% of households were dedicated to the e-waste recycling industry, processing about 15,000 tons a day, usually with very little safeguards to human health, such as you can see in this picture, a worker getting solder off circuit boards. But I don't want to talk about Southeast Asia today. I want to talk about somewhere that's receiving far more European waste than American waste, and that is Ghana in West Africa, which is the home to Abablushi. Abablushi is essentially a scrapyard. It will process anything with metals in it, not just electronics. There are a few examples here: domestic appliances, even car doors. And it provides for about 80,000 workers and their families, most of whom have come from northern Ghana, and they've come down to the capital looking for work. And when we were first there in 2013, it was ranked in the top 10 most toxic sites on the planet by the Blacksmith Institute, now Pure Earth, alongside Chernobyl. Now, Abablushi is a chaotic place. It's a bit of an assault on the senses, but there is a certain kind of order to the chaos, and I'll tell you a little bit about how the process works. Young men and boys trawl the streets of Accra looking for broken electronics from businesses and households, and they bring them back to the site where they are at first dismantled with hammer and chisel, and they're looking for much the same elements that a formal recycling facility would be looking for: aluminium, steel, and particularly in the case of Abablushi, copper. And one of the biggest sources for copper in electronics is the wires that are used to power it. So they bundle these wires together in great big balls and then burn them in order to get the plastic off. These are the images that Abablushi are famous for, and it's probably the most dangerous process that happens on the site. It does create a lower grade of copper, but still one that is perfectly sellable, and it's given to scrap dealers on the site, who then sell it on. There are very little, again, human health protections. As you can see, people work on the site wearing little more than flip-flops. And wounds like you see on this worker's leg here, scars from dismantling and burning, are very common. In fact, when we were there, somebody lost their eye from shrapnel coming off one of the burning sites. But these scars kind of mask what could be the most dangerous part of working on an electronic waste site. The main character of e-life is a Ghanaian scientist called Samson Atiyamo, who's in this shot here. He released his first paper on the toxicity at Abablushi in 2012, and he found that levels of things like lead and cadmium and zinc were 1,000 times over levels recommended by the United Nations for state intervention. And there have been a lot of these studies that have been done. A more recent one by the Basel Action Network found that if you ate a single egg from a free-range chicken on Abablushi, and there's a lot of livestock that are on the site, if you ate a single egg from a free-range chicken on Abablushi, you'd exceed the European Food Safety Authority's levels on chlorinated dioxins by 220 times. Now, toxicity is notoriously difficult to diagnose, toxic poisoning. Even if the workers had access to basic health care, which they don't because insurance is too expensive. And Samson said that many of the symptoms of toxic poisoning, headaches, nausea, and all of that, were simply misdiagnosed as malaria. Now, there have been several attempts to shut down Abablushi, all of which have failed, because at the end of the day, countries like Ghana have very little formal recycling in them, which means that if you shut down Abablushi, another informal waste site is just going to pop up elsewhere. As long as there are precious metals inside these electronics, people will try and get inside. And where this e-waste is coming from is also a bit of a complex issue, because a lot of it is generated by Ghana itself, but Ghana has a thriving reuse and second-hand economy, unlike developed nations. And so new electronics are quite expensive, second-hand electronics are a lot cheaper, and so as much as 70% of imported electronics are second-hand. And it's been estimated that as much as 20% of those second-hand electronics are coming into the country just broken, probably destined for things like the repair and resale market, where that is illegal under the Basel Convention. Now, it's all pretty bleak stuff, as I'm sure you can imagine. There have been studies throughout the world on the toxicity of these informal waste dumps. A particularly depressing one from the University of Queensland, looking at Southeast Chinese informal waste sites, found that there are increased levels amongst e-waste workers and their families of things like spontaneous abortions, stillbirths, premature births, reduced birth rates, reduced birth lengths, and DNA damage because of the exposure to the elements that through e-waste processing. Things are changing. Countries are starting to ban the importation of electronic waste. Kenya, for example, is doing it this year. China did so in 2017. Which brings us around to the final destination, or destinations, landfill and dumping. Landfill is essentially when e-waste is bundled in to municipal waste and buried in the ground. And what I'd like to talk about here is resource scarcity. There are formal recycling and informal recycling, to varying degrees, recover the resources that go into electronics manufacturing and put them back into the supply chain. But when they're buried in the ground, those resources are lost forevermore. And the problem is that these resources are finite. The BBC Futures programme did a study a couple of years back looking at how long it would take certain of these resources to run out if current extraction rates continued, and the results were quite surprising. Things like aluminium, tantalum, and titanium running out towards the end of this century. Silver was given 9 years, and antimony was given until this year. But running out is not exactly the right way to look at this. For example, extraction technologies are developed all the time, new deposits are discovered, and also because the more the resource runs out, the more expensive it becomes, and that can hasten the decline in that resource, such as things like with the bluefin tuna, for example. But if that resource has been used in the manufacturing of something else, the cumulative price appreciation means that manufacturers will start to look for resources elsewhere. And the problem with that is that Yale University did a big study a couple of years back that found that of all the 62 metalloids and metals in the periodic table, none had an exemplary substitute for all their major uses. 12 had no replacement at all, including copper, chromium, manganese, and lead. Which is why more and more people now are looking towards landfill mining as a viable way of extracting some of these resources. And you can see why. As the US Environmental Protection Agency said, 1 metric ton of circuit boards can contain 40 to 800 times the amount of gold than from 1 metric ton of ore in the United States. And of course, it's not just resources in landfill. As some of you may remember, the Atari game dump that was partially excavated out of a New Mexico landfill in 2014. So is there any good news? I mean, it's all pretty bleak stuff. I'm sure you'll agree. But things are changing. Today, about 2/3 of the world's population is now covered by some form of e-waste legislation, up from 44% in 2014. But if things really are going to change, it's the manufacturers have to change the way that they do things. And there are certain signs that this is happening. For example, there are German researchers that are looking into biodegradable electronics, of all things. Apple has come up with its very own recycling robot. Dell has a take-back scheme for all electronics, not just its own. And then you get characters like Fairphone in the Netherlands, who are doing amazing things about disrupting the manufacturing chain for making cell phones, from where they source minerals from to designing with modularity in mind, so repairability is more of a more realistic. But then it's consumers that really need to change, and that has happened before. Now the European Union is banning single-use plastics, and that's all because of growing consumer awareness about the harm single-use plastics can do to the environment. We're not there yet with electronic waste. There isn't that same exposure, but with esteemed people such as yourselves spreading the words, I am quite hopeful. Thank you very much.